Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined by Matlick as always.
Howdy.
And we're stoked to be joined by our friend Brian Mier. You know Brian Mier from BrasilWire and also from Telesur English. How's it going, Brian?
Well, better than the corporate media would have you believe as someone who supports former President Lula.
Yeah,
Not
I mean,
bad.
no, I mean, that's what we brought you on to talk about. I mean, just setting the stage a little bit, there were the first round elections. And while I think a lot of us had hoped that it would be a one and done in the sense that Lula would have crossed 50% to win it outright, a lot of the media coverage so far has been quite dour. That Lula didn't cross that 50% threshold. But I mean, judging from talking to you, we were hanging out a little bit before the stream. I mean, you're not in a very bad mood. I mean, I think there's a lot to be extremely optimistic about from this first round elections. I mean, could you give people a taste of what happened over the weekend?
Well, first of all, the media was setting up Lula to fail, right? So they were exaggerating the probability of a first round victory, which nobody from the Workers' Party has ever pulled off. They took the presidency 4 times already and never happened with a first round victory. There hasn't been a first round victory this century, and a challenger has never even beaten an incumbent in the first round of a presidential election in Brazil since the return to democracy in 1985. So let's go back to 4 years ago, right? In the first round, Bolsonaro had around over 40 million votes. I think it was 49. And challenger Fernando Haddad, who was just put in at the last minute after the Brazilian courts decided to ignore the order from the UN that was legally binding that told them they had to let Lula run. They put Haddad in 30 days before the election. He had like 24 million votes in the first round. Okay, so what happened yesterday was over double that number of votes. Lula got 10 million votes more than he's ever gotten in any election in his life. Okay, that's the reason that the papers and the media was setting Lula up to fail on this was because they were just like misinterpreting your basic election poll. David, you as an economist must know about margin of error and things like that. But it doesn't seem like very many journalists know that. I've had to repeat over and over in Brazil and Portuguese on the web TV program. I'm like, look, if Datafolha says it's 50%, what they're really saying that Lula's polling at 50%, they're saying that there's a 95% chance that he's polling between 48 and 52%. That's what the poll means. It doesn't mean he's going to win in the first round. But newspaper after newspaper was just suggesting, oh yeah, he's going to win in the first round, to make it look like anything other than a first round win would be this horrible failure. Another excuse to beat up on the left. Oh, what did they do wrong? The Guardian's wringing their hands. Oh, the tragedy. How could they be so weak? How could they have not, it would have been great. Obviously Lula's saying yeah, it would have been great, but they had a victory party after the results came in, and tens of thousands of people came out with Lula on the streets in downtown Sao Paulo, just cheer and commemorate. So obviously there's some bad things, there's some really shitty results, but for the most part, it's more good than bad. Basically what happened is Bolsonaro beat the spread, according to the polls, which was a little bit scary because they reported in the more conservative states first. So for half of the tallying period, which in Brazil is only 3 hours, compared to the United States.
Yeah.
During that 3 hours, for the first hour and 20 minutes, Bolsonaro was actually ahead, and that was freaking out a lot of people. But they waited to bring in the results from the Northeast, which is a leftist stronghold in Brazil, at the end. And, he passed him up, and he won by 6.2 million votes. Proportionally speaking, that would be over 9 million votes in the U.S., because Brazil has 2/3 the population of the U.S. And the last time that's happened in the U.S. was 2008, right? Obama and McCain. So that's a sizable win. It isn't like Lula just eked by Bolsonaro or something. That's 6.2 million votes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it is just. Oh, sorry, David. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I just think it's important to note, why one. I mean, we're obviously covering the second round, and that's a very important election. but it's important to like get these narratives right, I think, too, because this is how like media narratives are going to be framed going into the election season. And it's just like the way that like election results are reported, there is like a kind of like sports match like aspect to it, where it's like, oh, what areas are getting their votes counted first, making this kind of narrative of like, oh well, Lula caught up at the last minute to like overtake Bolsonaro, instead of it just being kind of random occurrence about what votes were being tallied versus others.
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, sports, for good and for bad. I mean, people say that Americans or people from the United States are better at statistics because of baseball than people in a lot of other countries, because they don't really use stats, for example, in soccer, football, as they say. And you really, like, you go to countries where people don't play baseball, and they're normally not that good at statistics, but we all know that they're ridiculous, meaningless statistics just presented in any baseball game for entertainment purposes, or a basketball game or whatever, because I mean, it's like, look, if you're going into like, how many times in postseason has this or that happened, you've already really diminished the pool, the statistical pool, right? And there's things like that. But in this, and I could say, okay, so an incumbent has never lost a first round election. That's not such an important statistic. It's almost like one of these meaningless sports statistics, except that it is true, and so it's worth mentioning. And there have been a lot of elections. So, but it's not like I'm not building on thousands of elections to generate this statistic from it. I guess you could say it's more of an anecdote than a true statistic. I don't mean to be getting too much into statistics, David. I just know that you are a statistician, you're an economist. So.
You might be buttering me up, but I hear you.
Yeah, so isn't it basically the case that Lula did about what you would expect, maybe within the margin of error, and Bolsonaro overperformed basically at the cost of third parties? Is that basically what we're seeing? And also comment on, Bolsonaro being sort of anti-census, and that may be leading into why these polls were so wrong.
Well, there's two things going on. I think as the time passes, there's new information coming out. Okay, so first of all, Cyril Gomez, Glenn Greenwald's choice, right? For the last 3 months, he's been using just out of control, attacking Lula daily, and Bolsonaro has been using Cyril's campaign to attack Bolsonaro and to attack Lula, and Cyril's been actually using like fashware style political ads, and he had some really slick campaign manager, and it looked like he was actually just staying in the race to sabotage Lula's campaign and bring it to the final round to prevent him from winning the first round. And so at the last minute, his support cut in half, and the director of one of the larger polling agencies in Brazil, Quest it's called, I don't know how to pronounce it right in English, but he just said, look, most of the votes that went to Bolsonaro had migrated from Cyril Gomez. So Cyril Gomez had literally been like comparing Lula to the devil and stuff. I mean, they're former allies. It was just disgusting to watch. He was just a spoiler. And he was attacking Lula on abortion rights issues, like calling Lula a baby killer and all this crap, which is just not, blaming the current economic problems on Lula's government. Lula's been out of power for 12 years. It's just like, it was just outrageous. And so it looks like a lot of, a significant number of his followers jumped. And then it looks like Bolsonaro picked up a little bit more than expected because turnout was lower. And this, I think, has a stamp of Bannon on it, really, because they filled the polling centers with Bolsonarista volunteers, right? And Bolsonaro spent, as everyone knows, he spent the last year and a half trying to usurp confidence in the election process, right? There's going to be fraud, it's acceptable to fraud. It looks like what they might have been doing is deliberately slowing down the lines to drive up abstentions. And abstentions ended up much higher than usual, not much higher, but higher than usual. In the states where Bolsonaro had the least support, it looks like the lines were longer. And one of the reasons is they put this biometric system in that was optional. People who wanted could use the biometrics. but it looks like the biometrics were running much slower than they had run in tests. And so, for example, here in Recife, I was down in Sao Paulo, but in Recife, where I'm living now, my wife tells me that the lines were like 4 hours long. And they changed some of the voting centers at the last minute. And they unusually, like, they legalized drinking in most of the country. Like, they don't normally have bars open on election day. And so I think a lot of people are like, oh, let's go out and vote and then we'll meet at the bar. Because Sunday's like a major drinking day in Brazil. It's like part of the culture. Brazil has a big drinking culture anyway. A lot of people don't drink all week, and they'll just drink from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed on Sunday, right? Barbecue and stuff like that. And so, like, I think a lot of people were just like, oh, I'll go vote and then I'll meet my friends at the barbecue or at the bar or whatever. And they got there and the line was too big, and they're like, oh, whatever. It's just the first round, you know? So it looks like that. Because, you know, like, even in U.S. politics especially, right, anywhere in the world, abstentions always favors the incumbent. That's why political machines try to drive down participation. It's been the secret of the Daley family in Chicago since the 1950s.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff is classic, changing polling places and understaffing them so people have to wait in super long lines. We've seen that in the Twitter era of just insanely long, in the drone footage era. You know, this is a very modern and, I mean, tried and true strategy.
Yeah, but you know, the thing that's really fucked about this, if you don't mind my swearing on your show, is that you know, because Bolsonaro and his military allies have spent the last year and a half mining away at confidence in the electoral system, now if leftists start complaining about it, we've been defending it for the last year and a half. Yeah. So if that's what they really did on purpose, then that to me seems like Bannon, you know, style strategy. And, you know, they're constantly communicating. On September 7th, my friend who I was just mentioning to you guys, Danny Shaw, was down here in Rio de Janeiro. And just because he's like a super tall American guy and he's bald and he's a former boxer. So they probably just assumed he was right wing in this pro Bolsonaro rally he was walking through. They invited him up on top of a sound car and he bumped into Jason Miller. He was like, sent me a WhatsApp like, I just met this guy named Jason Miller. Who's Jason Miller? It's like, well, what's Jason Miller doing on a sound car on a Bolsonaro rally? Because obviously these guys are communicating the whole time, right? And so that could have been like a kind of strategy. But even if it wasn't enough to prevent Lula from beating him by 6.2 million votes. And I feel like abstentions are going to be a lot lower in the second round because people are going to be like, you know, shit, we have to win this thing. I can't go to the barbecue. I'm going to wait.
Well, you can after Lula wins, right?
That drives me crazy. That conflation of the two different concerns about the electoral process, right? Like from the right, it's not like our concerns is that votes aren't being collected and counted that should be collected and counted. Theirs is that there's some conspiracy to like stuff the ballots, and those are fundamentally not the same thing. And it's very frustrating when particularly like high-profile journalists conflate those two things. As look, both sides do the fear-mongering about election integrity.
Yeah, it's just I don't know. In general, though, I will say that elections in Brazil are a lot smoother than they are in the U.S. You know,
it's interesting. You mentioned we've talked before about the computer ballots, which is something I'm scared of. Like I'm old-fashioned. I want all paper ballots, but if it works, you
want hanging chads.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Old-fashioned.
Well, Brian, obviously we want to talk a little bit about the outlook and some of the characters. Obviously we can't go through this entire map, but if you were to give, Americans who might not be familiar, with Brazil, the political geography, etc., so it's like anything that sort of stands out for you or anything that you think is sort of worth highlighting about some of these results that we got from the first round?
I can't. All I see is a big black blotch on the screen.
Oh, for real.
So, power outages have been a problem in some polling stations. No, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely it's definitely our issue. Well, we can.
I can describe it. It was a map that divided the country into red and blue. Unlike the United States, the Workers' Party actually does use the color red as its official color, so it's more apt. And what it's showing basically is that in 2018, the only region that Fernando Haddad carried in the election was the Northeast. That's the part of the Brazilian map that looks kind of like like an arm coming out, right? It's the part that goes east like that. From around here to around here, or here to around here, that's the Northeast, right? You see that's all in red on the map that we can't see right now. But basically what it's showing is that this time around, in addition to the south, to the northeast of Brazil, here we go. So you see there's that kind of like elbow pointing out there on the right. In addition to that region, which is all pink, right? Lula carried the north. Okay, he carried the north, and so that's two regions. Now you see all these big blue states that are kind of below the top part, the north there, going down. Those are states with really low populations, right? The real population center of Brazil is the southeast. This map is breaking it down by county, right? There's over 5,000 counties in Brazil. But you see if you look down below the elbow part sticking to the right of the image there, there's one state that's outlined in black. That's Minas Gerais. It's the third most populated state in Brazil, and Lula also carried that. You can't tell because it's showing some counties in blue, but overall, Lula also carried that. He lost in Rio and São Paulo, which is, a pretty big deal. It's pretty disgusting, really. That, if it weren't for Rio and São Paulo, he would have won in the first round. So Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo really cost him a first round victory.
What would you attribute that to? I mean, I know it's pretty early, but how's the campaigning and the politics looking in those parts of the country?
Well, Rio de Janeiro is Bolsonaro's stronghold, and it's also the first state in Brazil that ever became majority evangelical Christian. So I was expecting him to carry Rio de Janeiro. São Paulo was polling about even, and Bolsonaro ended up winning by about 7 points there. That's disturbing. And the gubernatorial race just didn't pan out at all like it had been polled. Fernando Haddad was leading by like 10 points, and he ended up coming in second, like 8 points or something behind the Bolsonaro's candidate, who isn't even from the state of Sao Paulo, who's from Rio. Just another one of these clown candidates who doesn't have any governmental experience or anything, former military. But, there's all kinds of super interesting stuff that happened at the different level elections. You can't call this in any way, shape, or form a defeat when the Workers' Party gained. The Workers' Party returned its presence in Congress to the same level it had when Dilma Rousseff was president. There's been 6 years of suffering, of PT getting hit, constantly in the media, and they're back to where they were when Dilma was president. They picked up 12 new members of Congress. Their congressional levels grew, I don't know what it is, by 20-something%. And in the Senate, which has never been a PT stronghold, it's never been a left stronghold, but they picked up 3 more senators since 2019, which represents a 50% increase for them. And then in the state legislature of Sao Paulo, they grew by 80% and transformed into the second biggest party in the legislature. And there's all kinds of because in 2016, the laws changed and all the political parties it's not enough to have ethnic equity among your candidates. You have to spend your party fund equitably according to the ethnicity of the candidates. So all of a sudden, all of these parties have to have equity in elected officials being Afro-Brazilian because Brazil's 52% black, And there's all these really interesting young politicians coming up within the Workers' Party that did historic first, like in Paraná, Sergio Moro's state, his home state. Carol D'Artora became the first ever black woman congressperson from that state. And she's not an identity politics, generic Kamala Harris type or something. She was a teachers union leader before she was elected to city council 2 years ago. And she's already a federal congresswoman. She's a rising star within the party. And there's all kinds of examples. The landless workers movement decided to get involved in politics this year, and they elected 6 state or federal members of Congress, showing that they're a political force to be reckoned with. And they're, straight up socialists. They fight for agrarian reform for disappropriating land, the plantations and the big agribusiness plantations from the rich, because those people didn't buy the land, they just stole the land.
I mean, so there's certainly a lot that we saw in like the lower ballot races that's very encouraging for PT and the left in general. But I mean, could you give people a sense at some of the more unfortunate results, and also what that would mean, God willing, Lula's, is able to carry in the second round, what that would mean for, who he would be governing with when he becomes president?
Well, yeah, the bad news is like some of the worst, most nefarious, like anti-political clown characters from Bolsonaro's cabinet got into Senate, like Damares Alves, who claims that Jesus gave her master's degree.
That's fake.
She didn't actually study at a university, but she said she had a master's on her resume. No, Jesus gave it to me. Evangelicals have a different relationship with education. And also that, she spoke to Jesus once in a guava tree. She has conversations with Jesus. And so she's now a fucking senator, which is ridiculous. That's disgusting. But the worst thing is Sergio Moro getting elected to the Senate, because he was getting his ass kicked in the polls. And I don't know what happened, but basically this means he's protected for the next 8 years from any criminal prosecution. He's got like 12 investigations against him right now. And for those who don't know, Moro was he was the judge who ruled over the investigation into Lula, and he was allowed to rule on the own investigation he oversaw with no jury, in this bizarre legal loophole that goes back to the Inquisition, basically. I mean, his role in that whole process, literally, according to Portuguese law, is inquisitor. He's literally an inquisitor. And now we know, of course, that it was all just spurious charges with no evidence.
And when it comes to borrow some language from our evangelical friends, to repenting, it doesn't look like Moro's too interested in this. He's throwing his weight behind the beneficiary of his first investigation, Bolsonaro.
Yeah, and it's funny because they were pretending to be, and he was pretending to not like Bolsonaro for a while when he resigned from his cabinet. He was acting like he and Bolsonaro were enemies, but now they're back together. So,
well, other important figures. I mean, could you just briefly remind people who might have forgotten or don't know who Cyril Gomez is, and what's going on with him when it comes to this second round race between Bolsonaro and Lula?
Well, Cyril Gomez is a career politician and opportunist who has switched political parties 5 times. He's been in right-wing parties and left-wing parties. He was part of the right-wing Itamar Franco government and helped push through the most neoliberal anti-inflation plan ever executed in Latin America, which literally put Brazil in the Guinness Book of World Records for highest interest rates. And I remember, because I was in Brazil then, like everyone was like, "Oh, this is so great." Like, no, it's not great. My credit card's now charging 13% per month interest. That was the result of Cyril Gomez's, but he's shifted more and more to kind of like the center left for a while. He was a cabinet minister in Lula's government, and he ran in 2018. And up until that point, he was always saying that Lula was unjustly imprisoned and that people were being unfair with the PT. But then it looks like he got more and more pissed off because the PT didn't nominate him as the candidate and get behind his candidacy. Because his argument was that there was such a climate of anti-left sentiment, anti-PT sentiment. You needed someone more in the middle. So he was running from the right of the PT with the argument that he'd be able to govern better. And he ended up getting like 13% in the first round. And then instead, he was so pissed off that the PT wouldn't back him, that instead of like pledging his votes to Fernando Haddad in the second round and helping with the campaign, he flew to Paris and took a vacation for a month.
Nice.
Right? And then since then, he's just been like more and more antagonistic towards the Workers' Party and towards the left. And he has anger management issues. He's blown up when Lula was in jail, he was trying to go around the country and and show himself as the new future for the left. And people would start talking about Lula, and he would just scream, "Lula's in jail, you asshole," and stuff like that. And then Greenwald started backing him, which is a bad sign, because Greenwald's never backed anyone in the PT anyway. So it's a bad sign. Then it looked like there's always this kind of spoiler who pretends to be a progressive alternative in every election in Latin America. It was Yacu Perez in Ecuador. Yeah. There's always someone who comes out. It was Marina Silva filled this role for a while in Brazil. And that's what Cyril did in 2018. And I predicted when Greenwald called up this podcast I was on with Ewan Higgins. I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
He called up and argued with me for an hour. He wasn't even invited on the show. And he was just screaming at me, "Cyril's a lifelong man of the left. How dare you? He's to the left of Lula. He's running to the left of Lula. How dare you call him a spoiler?" So anyway, he was wrong. So he's been really quiet about things. He tried to commit character assassination of Lula on election day. He tweeted out that the electoral court's ordering of this right-wing media site called Antagonista to pull off an obviously doctored audio in which someone claiming to be this drug kingpin, expressed support for Lula in the election. He said that was censorship, that this site was a victim of censorship, and that even though I don't support what they stand for, I have to, as the most ethical and moral human being on the face of planet Earth, defend them at this moment, because it's only election day.
Yeah.
And it's there is a rule of law in Brazil, and for the last couple of years, the left have been saying we have to rebuild the rule of law. So if you're going to attack the rule of law on election day, you're on Bolsonaro's side. That's what Bolsonaro's been doing for the last year, saying that you don't trust the electoral courts.
Yeah. Brian, I don't know if you saw, but Glenn did tweet about the election today. Actually,
now I didn't see it, but I saw that. Yeah.
So The Economist writes, a second term for Jair Bolsonaro, who spreads misinformation and undermines trust in democracy, would be bad for Brazil and the world. Only Lula can prevent it, claiming the center ground is the best way to do so. And Glenn says, this is the most Economist tweet ever. But it's also more evidence of the fact that the Western establishment fears right-wing populism more than left liberal politics. So I don't know if you have a response to that, Brian.
Yeah, sure. The only way you could make that argument about Lula is if you wrote an entire book about Lava Jato and didn't once mention U.S. Department of Justice and FBI involvement in that investigation that was revealed by your own former employer, Intercept, with the leaks that he obviously sat on this information for a year and didn't release it. It was only released by other journalists inside the Intercept. He doesn't even mention U.S. involvement. I mean, Hank Johnson and Susan Wild and Ilhan Omar and a group of 16 Congress members of Congress have repeatedly sent inquiries to the Department of Justice for them to clarify their role in Lula's imprisonment, in his political imprisonment. And one of the responses from the DOJ is we've been talking about our partnership in Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash, on our own website since 2016. There's publicly available information. Yet Glenn has never mentioned that. He doesn't mention it in his book. So if in your mind the U.S. wasn't involved in Lula's imprisonment or in Lava Jato, then maybe you could say, the U.S. really likes Lula. If they like Lula so much, why did they help put Bolsonaro in power? That's the first. The second thing, it's even more obvious. Ask Glenn to name the political party of Bolsonaro. Glenn, what party are you talking about? What party is he in? What party is Bolsonaro in? Come on, Tucker and Glenn, name the party. Well, the name of the party is the Liberal Party. Bolsonaro's literally, leading the Liberal Party, and his economics chief is a classic neoliberal who studied under Milton Friedman at University of Chicago in the 1970s. Apparently, one of the most mediocre of the Chicago boys.
Is that anti-establishment Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro versus the establishment and the whole media and everything? Is that for domestic consumption in Brazil too, or is that just something like Tucker talks about here?
I think he tries to copy Trump, so it's also for domestic consumption. But all the polls show that the biggest support demographic for Lula the entire time, his entire life, his 50-year political career, it's always been people making less than 2 times the minimum wage. This year, they're more than 2 times more likely to vote for Lula than Bolsonaro. They're the only economic demographic that supports Lula.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is for Bolsonaro that 70% of the Brazilian population makes less than 2 times the minimum wage. Every other economic bracket upwards, supports Bolsonaro. The people making over 10 times the minimum wage are almost twice as likely to vote for Bolsonaro than Lula. And of course, Bolsonaro's backers are all, I guess you could call them comprador bourgeoisie or comprador elites. They're like, billionaires and multimillionaire Brazilians. And we see obviously Fox likes him, and obviously Chevron and the big pesticide companies and the mining industry likes him a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see like if Wall Street Journal has weighed in this time, but they did endorse him in 2000.
They endorsed him last time, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Fox is endorsing him. I bet. Well, Murdoch endorsed. It's Murdoch Industries or whatever. So I'm sure Wall Street Journal will endorse him again.
Well, let's look a little bit in the words of the man himself about what he's been saying. Oh, shit, I don't know how that got on there. But
that's what Tucker said.
Here's one of the tweets that Bolsonaro has made recently. I'll read it for the podcast audience. Also, let us know if the Google Translate is way off, Brian. But Bolsonaro said the equivalent of, against everything and everyone, we had a more expressive vote in the first round of 2022 than the one we had in 2018. There are almost 2 million more votes. We have also elected the largest benches in the House and Senate, which was our top priority at this first moment. I mean, how do you feel about Bolsonaro's characterization of this election so far?
It's misleading because per capita, he hasn't had any increase. Mm-hmm. Because there's more people voting this time around, and the population has grown a little bit. Number of registered voters has grown a little bit, and it wasn't 2 million. He says almost 2 million. It was like 1 million, 0.2 or something. And he lost by 6.2 million votes.
That's about to say it's a lot less than what he needs, right?
Yeah, I mean, he now needs like 4 votes for every 1 vote that Lula has to pick up to beat Lula. Right. But you don't know, you never know what can happen. But it definitely looks better for Lula than it does for him right now. The only worry is this kind of like, are they gonna keep doing this thing with the biometrics and try and slow things down? But I don't think it'll be enough. And you know what? It's very deceiving to say we won the largest number of seats in the House and Senate. That's completely deceiving because the Liberal Party, which he and his liberal elite buddies belong to, is almost like a rent-a-party. And so there's a tradition in Brazil where everyone in the center right and the right tries to stick to the person who's in power. And they feel like it's a way to get elected. They had the majority before. The parties all changed. Like Bolsonaro changed parties. He was elected as a representative of the Social Liberal Party. That party like disappeared into thin air. It merged with another party. But the year he got elected, that had the largest number of seats in the Senate and Congress. And now it's just disappeared into thin air. It doesn't even exist anymore. It's not like a real party. And so all it means is that like even at the height of Lula's popularity, when he was polling in the 80% range, the left only had about 25% control of Congress because there was a Congress and Senate during the military dictatorship. And when the dictatorship ended, they simply allowed all of those people to hang on to their seats. And they would only leave office if they had lost an election. And, it always favors the incumbents. So since then, these 2 parties that have descended from those 2 official dictatorship parties have always together held a majority in the House and Senate. And so this is really no different. Like one of the official dictatorship parties is part of Bolsonaro's coalition.
Well, in the last couple of minutes, in a second, I want to ask you about your sort of outlook, for a second round. But Benjamin Fogel was on our friends, the American Prestige podcast recently, and he made a point. One of his kind of takeaways from this first round is that it seems not necessarily a majority, but it seems that there is a kind of entrenched Bolsonaro kind of supporting a Bolsonaro like ideology that is going to be a force in Brazilian politics for the time being. And I was curious if you agree with that or not. Like Bolsonaro and what he sort of unleashed is going to last longer than he might as a presidential candidate.
Well, look, I've been living in Brazil for 27 years, right? There's always been that part of Brazilian politics. It used to be a guy named Paulo Maluf, who was governor of Sao Paulo and mayor of Sao Paulo. He supported death squads. When he was governor, he had police beat up anybody they caught on the street without a signed work card. He divided the population into bums and workers. So I got a friend who was arrested when he went out looking for a job. He was black too. He spent 2 weeks in jail and got beaten up because he was out on the street with his resume looking for a job and didn't have a work contract with him. And you have these legalized death squads operating out of the military police because the military police were never like dictatorships. They were left to exist on after the dictatorship in a kind of state of exception. Military police officers don't respond to the normal rule of law. So first it was Maluf. All of the crazy right-wing people you knew would support Maluf. Then there was a guy named Enéas, who was like literally a fascist, who became the most voted congressman in the history of Sao Paulo. And so what you have is, ever since I moved to Brazil, it's been like 20-25% fascist. What you have is a bit of a spike with Bolsonaro. And I think that's just because of this tendency of Brazilian people that it goes back to like colonial times and stuff like that, of like wanting to be on the winning side in the political dispute. So I think there's a swing of people who side over to Bolsonaro, but these hardcore fascists, they say about half of his followers are really like hardcore fascist types. And the other half are just like, in my opinion, people who don't know that much about politics, maybe, or just really religious or something. This 18%, 20% of the Brazilian population, it's always been here since Nazi times in the 1930s, and it's not going anywhere. We'll have a big problem when Lula wins that so many Bolsonaro allies are in the House and Senate. But when Lula was president before, the House and Senate was full of far right-wing operatives, Maybe they were just a little bit more polite. I think that has more to do with social media, the fact that everyone's so confrontational now, than with any kind of like shift that Brazil is more fascist than it was before, in my opinion.
Well, I just want to, I'm sure we're definitely be covering this election a lot this month. So this isn't the final analysis or anything like that, but we're sitting here a couple days after that first round election. What do you think is going to be, do you think there's going to be much of a pivot in the way Lula's campaigning going into the second round, or do you think he's going to continue, hitting the same issues that he's been? What's your feeling? What should people be watching for in the next couple of weeks?
The coalitions he has to set up to get support from the third and fourth place candidates. He's already got support from Ciro's party, PDT. And Ciro today already said, whatever you do, don't vote for Bolsonaro, vote for the other guy. But he wouldn't say Lula's name. All Lula needs is half of those votes. And he's already won the election because Ciro got like 3.3%, right? So even if half of them come to him, and then the other candidate who did better than Ciro, who inched him out for third place, Simone Tebet, is from the MDB party. It was the official opposition party during the military dictatorship. It was kind of like the Democratic Party in the US. It had some more left-wing people in it. The dictatorship basically just copied the US. We said, okay, we can have two parties. All the other parties we're not going to allow them to exist. And within that like broad tent of the MDB, you had some real right-wing jerks, and you also had a couple left-wing people who joined other parties after the end of the dictatorship. But it's important to note, they backed Lula. They were part of Lula's coalition from 2004 to 2015, ending up holding the vice presidential spot with Dilma Rousseff and then stabbing her in the back and going forwards with the impeachment. So there's a lot of reasons to not trust them at the same time, they have been an important ally of the PT in the past. And so, maybe there's a better chance that she'll come on board with Lula. In the last debate, it looked like she was talking about future, partnership with Lula. So I think she said she's going to make an announcement in the next couple of days. I think they're going to go with Lula as well. And if that happens, it's going to be really hard for Bolsonaro. Or his American handlers. Far-right American puppet masters.
Well, Brian, it's a pleasure, as always, to have you on the program. People want to read more about some of the arguments that Brian laid out. You can read his pieces in BrasilWire. Media spins Lula victory as defeat. As always, make sure you're reading Brian at BrasilWire, checking out his work at Telesur. And thank you so much. We're always honored to have you on the program.
It's always great to talk with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.